Welcome, listeners, to So Very Wrong About Games. My name is Michael Walker, and I'm here with my co-host, Mark Bigney. How are you today, Mark?
I am psyched, I am pumped, I am high on topical steroids. How are you?
Good. It is family day, and I'm glad we get to spend this family day with our board gaming family here.
Aww.
In the United States of America. It is President's Day.
Is it?
It is, and I'm sure they love their president like a family member.
No. I think this is President's Day like for past presidents, because it used to be Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday. There used to be separate holidays, and then I think they merged them.
It's weird that they had their birthdays on the same day, but
no, that is not what happened. They merged them as part of the United States' relentless quest to have as few federal holidays as possible, and to only grudgingly give people days off.
So welcome to the show. Besides politics, we're also going to talk about...
That wasn't a political statement.
I'm just joking. We're also going to talk about board games. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the game we reviewed exactly 1 year ago.
And what a game it is.
What a game. And then we're going to talk about the games that we played this week. Then we're going to talk about some news and why it doesn't matter. And then we're going to talk about our topic of the week, which is game design trends. Mark, exactly 1 year ago, we reviewed a Reiner Knizia game called Whale Riders.
We have a policy here, an informal policy between Walker and myself, because in our group, we are definitely the ones that acquire games. And roughly about 1.5 to 2 years ago, we stopped getting games that the other one had. But then there are exceptions. I bought a copy of Whale Riders at full retail price. After we did the review on Walker's copy, I was like, okay, Walker's got a copy. We have this policy, and then I couldn't maintain it. I just couldn't keep it up. Whale Riders is one of those times where I really think our initial impressions were right. I have played Whale Riders about half a dozen times since we reviewed it, because it is so immensely flexible. Non-hobbyist gamers, no problem. Experienced gamers, they love it too. Knee-deep hobbyist gamers, absolutely. People who hate Knizia, people who love Knizia. I mean... Whale Riders is an absolute winner. I think we were right to identify it as such right from the outset, and it's aged like fine wine over the course of the past 2 years. I'm a huge fan, and it's a shame that it's not in print. This should be in every mass market shelf in America.
It got published by an unfortunate publisher, but that's okay. Hopefully we'll see it again someday. It's very easily teachable, has an interesting theme that people can get right behind immediately. You're actually riding these giant whales.
And beautiful Vincent Dutrait art.
It's true, and you have these whale meeples.
Weeples?
Whale pulls?
We'll workshop that.
And it's a great game.
It's so good. Every time I play it, just the tension and trade-offs, and those are the kinds of things that I love, especially in simple, relatively straightforward Euro games like this. The feeling pulled in lots of different directions, but having to make some trade-offs and some risks. And I am a huge fan of Whale Riders. I'm very glad that I picked up my own copy, and so now I can play it whenever I want to.
It's true. And that is the game we reviewed exactly 1 year ago. Now, onto the games we played this week. Mark, what did you get to play this week?
I played a game called Godtear. I first talked about this a few years ago because I played a starter set. Godtear is a game published by Steamforged Games, and it's sort of a two-player skirmishy thing. And the starter set for Godtear is a throwback to old-style tabletop miniatures game starters, which is to say, you can technically play something resembling a game with what's inside this box, but nothing that actually resembles the actual game inside this box. In Godtear, really what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have 3 factions against 3 factions, and the starter set contains 2 factions. And I played it with Chip the Third a whole bunch of years ago, and it's like, yeah, there's not much here. I can't really talk about the game because it ain't there. And people are like, how dare you not review it in its fullness? And it's like, no, I'm not going to buy 6 faction boxes total to be able to get the full Godtear experience when I'm so offended with the distribution model. So I got it in trade. Suffice to say, I figured, well, I'd be vaguely curious, especially since lately a number of critics, particularly Charlie Thiel, have been really talking about how enthusiastic they are about Godtear. So I got it to the table again. It's better with 3-on-3 factions, but it feels a little constrained, actually, with 3 factions, because the movement rules are actually very confining in a number of ways. Not confining the way Shadespire is confining. Warhammer Underworlds is confining in the sense that if you move somebody, they're going to be stuck there for the rest of the round. That I really enjoyed. But in the sense of Godtear, people just get clumped up together, and the movement restrictions are pretty striking. And so on a number of occasions, the territory control was determined more by just bottling up choke points than anything else. And that was potentially interesting, but I didn't find it nearly as satisfying as I would have hoped. You do get some interesting combinatoric aspects with, okay, I'm going to use this faction's special power to buff this other faction. I had one champion who was incredibly deadly, but had a movement rating of 1, and so I had to use another faction to help him move a whole space, and so every time I had the champion move, I go, ugh! And eventually he got to the middle of the board and started raining down destruction and chaos upon all who befell him. And so that was vaguely satisfying. But all told, in terms of the amount of money you need to get started in Godtear, and in terms of the amount of game you get once you're there, I wasn't that impressed. I mean, there's a lot of other alternatives in the 2-player fighty genre. I mean, Sakura Arms at least starts getting into that, and other 2-player card battlers, I think, are also good competition for something along the lines of Godtear. If you want to play a 2-player game with miniatures, I mean, any one of the 2-player MOBA-inspired games I think would be good. I'd much rather play Battle for Eternia, which is a cheap and cheerful box. Anyway.
The giant miniature one.
Gatefall.
Yes,
and there's some expansion content that we haven't tried yet. Yeah, Gatefall's good too. There's a lot of competition there, and the amount of money they want for the factions, and you don't even get as much variety as I'd like. I'm sitting there, and I've got 6 different cards of units with special abilities, but at the end of the day, a lot of them are about, well, this attack rolls 5 dice to hit and 7 dice to damage, and this attack rolls 4 dice to hit and 8 dice for damage. I'm like, okay, great. So
played with the numbers a bit.
Yeah, it was enjoyable. It was fine. I'll play any 2-player skirmishy thing. But honestly, I was a bit let down based on the enthusiasm that other people have reported with Godtear and the amount of perceived effort necessary to get a full game going. I'd play it again, but I don't think I'd suggest it, especially given that the competition for 2-player skirmish type games is very, very, very high. And honestly, the way Steamforged Games distributes things is generally a nightmare, so I'm eager not to have too much contact with that company.
So is it closer to a miniature game, or is it closer to a board game, do you think?
It's closer to a miniature game. It's a miniature skirmish board game. It doesn't have the same sense of tabletop minis games, of the full range of analog movement, and of the genuine variety of powers that you can have. But it's definitely not a board game with miniatures in terms of, well, you're actually doing worker placement or you're actually doing auctions. Gotcha. You know, it feels a lot like, it's kind of in the same mold as Heroescape, suffice to say, kind of bridging the gap.
It sounds less collectible too. It looks like you buy what you need and then you're kind of done. In a way.
It depends. I mean, they sell the factions individually, and each faction is reasonably expensive, and it can consist of anywhere from 2 to sometimes as many as 7 or 8 miniatures. I don't feel like you're getting a tremendous bang for your buck, again, in terms of faction variety or in terms of the quality of the miniatures themselves. But look, I could definitely perceive, if I had access to more factions for free, I would enjoy tinkering with army composition, possibly, but as it stands in the way that it's distributed, I'm not inclined to do so, ultimately. And so that's my further experiences with Godtear. A bit of a disappointment by Steamforged Games.
Speaking of kind of miniature games, we got to play Aliens, Another Glorious Day in the Core. This is designed by Andrew Haught and put out by Gale Force 9. It is yet another game based off of the Aliens with an S franchise. You play the core. They put you through the different missions based on the movie itself.
And/or Ripley and/or Burke.
And/or true enough, we had someone brave enough to take Burke.
Burke was the MVP, actually.
It's true. And it is a game that's based around modifying, no, I shouldn't say modifying, but sort of manipulating a single deck of cards.
Yes.
You're going to be reducing it for shooting and moving and drawing, and all sorts of different things are going to happen to this deck because you don't want it to run out, stuff like that. So like someone had said, it sort of takes the tension away from where the tension should be, which is on the board and the aliens attacking you, and focuses it on this deck, which sort of makes the game not as fun as I think it could have been.
I agree 100%. You should be afraid of the alien that's going to charge you this round, not afraid that the deck is going to run out and you're going to lose of exhaustion. It drains the tension out, and I've maintained from the beginning of playing Aliens Another Glorious Day in the Core, the aliens aren't nearly deadly enough. Burke killed an alien in hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah, this is the same...
What the hell? What?
This is the same problem they had with the Starship Troopers game.
Oh, yeah?
Where every time an alien moved, you get to have reactive fire. And by that case, they never got close to you. Same in this game. As soon as an alien attacks, everyone within 4 spaces gets a chance to kill that alien.
Yes, and
it never gets to do anything.
The only trade-off wasn't, do I want to take this shot, or can I put myself in a position to take the shot? The only trade-off was, can I afford to exhaust the deck enough to take this shot? Which I understand what they're trying to go for. Some combination of limited ammo / exhaustion / terror. I don't know. But it doesn't feel like it's actually representing anything. And it doesn't feel remotely satisfying or remotely thematic. And as a consequence, the board play, the actual conflict with the aliens, feels borderline trivial, which makes it feel even further removed from the source material.
Which is too bad. There is a lot of good things to like about this game. You have an aim dial. Every time you shoot, it goes down. You have this interesting armor system where, depending on what you roll, you either, you block it or you actually do damage back, or you get to gear your Marines up at the beginning. All sorts of interesting things.
Yeah, if they'd tweaked what the cards represented and made the aliens more deadly, then I think there could have been something here. As it is, the leading contender for best aliens game remains the MVP, the 1989 Leading Edge Hobbies incredibly badly produced but nonetheless satisfying killathon, Aliens.
It's true.
Where everyone dies.
Well, if you want to go by exact name, but Space Hulk, which is obviously a direct comparison.
Space Hulk is a better game, but yes. Aliens is a better adaptation of the actual movie.
Agreed.
I mean, yes, the inspiration for Aliens is transparently evident in Space Hulk, but it feels sufficiently different in a number of respects. I guess that's a grudging compliment to Games Workshop, I suppose. Yes, the Leading Edge Hobbies game, which was a very, very early solo / co-op kind of game along those ilk, and it was definitely ahead of its time in a number of ways, very much of its time in others, but nonetheless gave you the satisfying feeling of the fact that everyone's going to die, especially Burke.
Yeah, production is great. Miniatures are odd. The Marines are fine. Aliens are a little bit sporadic, like their tentacles go out in all sorts of different directions, which sort of makes them unmanageable, but still highly paintable. So if you enjoy the movie as much as we do and enjoy collecting miniatures and painting, it could be something that is up your alley, but for the gameplay...
They do a solid effort for tying the property in to the actual game. A whole bunch of cards refer back to specific instances in the movie, and there are quotes aplenty across every possible component, which is great because Aliens is an eminently quotable film if you're enthusiastic about it. And so ultimately, again, that the fact that there's not really much tension in the actual gameplay is so crushingly disappointing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's not as though it's a movie still with a quote and then the gameplay does something completely different. It's that card will do something that's sort of tied into that whole scene.
Right. And the characters feel appropriate. Hudson wants a motion tracker. Drake and Vasquez want auto guns. Subtle flourishes like that. And so, yeah. Disappointing. I'd played it before when it first came out. Strangely enough, the timing is odd because just as people in the group requested to play it, and just as I started suggesting it again because I thought it would fit and people wanted to give it a shot, the second edition of the rules came out with very, very, very subtle rules modifications. Pro tip, by the way, to Gale Force 9 or anybody else, if you're going to release a second edition of a rules document, please include a changelog. Please let people know what it is, because if you know how the game works, it can be easy to just gloss over the differences. I found it very difficult to find the specific differences in the rule set. We ended up playing with the second edition rule set, and it's actually easier than the first edition in a couple of subtle ways. But overall, the changes are largely for the good.
It's not as though we cleared out the level. We did succeed in the mission.
It was a Pyrrhic victory, yes.
I don't think any of the Marines survived.
Correct.
The ramp up seemed ridiculously odd. It's like it goes from being ridiculous easy to impossible.
Yes, which is not what you want.
But hopefully other people have better trials than we did.
That's Aliens, another glorious day in the core. On the topic of two-player, vaguely skirmishy things that may or may not be within striking distance of MOBA-inspired, I got to play a game called Load, League of Ancient Defenders. This was published by Archon Studio in 2016. Archon Studio actually got their start in the business as Protos Productions during a effectively half-failed Kickstarter for Aliens vs. Predator miniatures game. And I think that there are some people that are still waiting for their stuff. I'm very sorry, and I would encourage you to stop holding your breath. At any rate, Load was a very derivative dice-chucking MOBA game that I nonetheless quite enjoy. I think it's good for some dumb fun. Lots of male gaze on a lot of the women figures. Some of them are okay, but a lot of it is pretty embarrassing. This is basically only for people who are hardcore into the MOBA derivative genres. And this is Very much kind of in the first wave of MOBA adaptations. That having been said, there's some house rules to bring it slightly more in line with some of the developments. For example, the alternating activation system that is reminiscent of the alternating activation system introduced in Rum and Bones Second Tide, so the second edition of Rum and Bones, can easily be backported into load, and that makes the game more dynamic and a little bit quicker. For those listeners who have been listening to recent episodes of Bloat, you may have been familiar with my quest to make sure that I had the epic versions of all the load minis. The quest is completed, and this is the first time I got to play all of them. And so now you have the lovely additional little choice when playing load. And that is, when is a hero done enough to warrant being upgraded to its epic version? Because they're in a different scale, they have better equipment. So one character in particular grew wings into their epic. Fascinating. No gameplay difference, of course. And I played with Chip the Third. This was one of the fascinating differences between me and Chip the Third. I found Chip the Third to be very stingy with his promotions. He would have characters, kill a couple heroes and then bust down a tower. I'm like, do you want to upgrade the miniature? He's like, maybe next round. I'm like, come on! Give them a bit of a cookie. They did a great job. But no. I, meanwhile, was simultaneously more and less supportive of my troops. Near halfway through the game, I started calling them scrubs. I felt that I'd been given nothing but scrubs. And no, I don't want no scrubs. A scrub is a mini that can get no love from me. I was very clear in the job posting. No scrubs and no people who chase waterfalls. And yet they sent me scrubs. Waterfall chasing scrubs. I nonetheless got to upgrade one of my miniatures. But honestly, load was really sort of a technical test for Archon Studios' new kind of minis production. They have this production called Unicast. It's kind of halfway between plastic and resin. Has some of the detail of resin, but more of the stability of plastic. Lovely, lovely sculpts. Lots and lots of detail. And they put out a couple of games, this and Vanguard of War, which is a pretty derivative tower defense thing. Also good for some stupid fun. And now they really don't make games anymore because they figured we could just make minis for role players. And so that's what they've been doing for the past little while. They have this line of miniature storing called Dungeons and Lasers, and they've been pumping that out wave after wave. And I say, more power to them. If you don't want to do game design, don't do game design. That's okay. But for what it's worth, I enjoy me some load. I'm not going to claim that it's interesting game design, but I do enjoy just shoving mobs at someone's face and rolling dice to do damage. And sadly, it's uncredited.
Oof.
Good job, Archon.
Archon made it, just the entity itself.
Yeah. So that's Load, League of Ancient Defenders. Definitely one of those things that I would not recommend, but that I have a great time playing.
Man, we played a lot of updated games this week, because this one I'm about to mention, and others that we're about to... Anyway, moving on. Warpgate. This is designed by...
Artyom Nichipurov.
And Wolff Designa. Same people from Guards of Atlantis 2.
And Guards of Atlantis 1 even.
And
Trickshot second season.
Ooh,
Trickshot first season.
All of those games.
All of those games, all of those people.
So what they've done, they've brought out an expansion that replaces practically all of the cards, if not all of the cards.
All the cards.
And they're updated, and some of them are the same, but now we have the same backs, so you can't tell if they're the old cards or the new cards.
Well, the most subtle difference is to the actual action cards that people play. They all now have initiative values, so you can play the simultaneous play variant, which is particularly recommended for high player counts. We haven't tried it yet, though.
So what you're doing in Warpgate is that you have a little tableau in front of you that has times 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you have a hand of actions, and you're playing them sort of Guards of Atlantis style, one per turn, and you're going to get multipliers on those cards depending on what round it is. And what you're doing with these actions is you're trying to take control of planets that are out there, trying to secure trade routes, trying to push people around, trying to create colonies, all in the hopes of focusing on these objective cards and trying to get the most points.
The objective card system, I think, is the one that has changed the most between Warpgate and Warpgate Beyond. The objectives in Warpgate were always felt a little bit fluky in that they were all or nothing, and you would get them secretly. And so you couldn't prepare for them. You'd get them maybe midway through the game, maybe near the end. They were difficult to get, appropriately enough, because they were potentially worth a huge amount of points, and indeed, dominant strategies and successful players tended to focus on at least a couple of objectives. But there was something about it that never really sat quite right with me. And the new system is, quite frankly, much better. The new system of objectives is there is a minor benefit for achieving some easier version and then a larger point benefit for achieving a more difficult version. And they are, a lot of them are less in terms of have the most of something. There's still lots of most of, but some of them are just have enough of these kinds of planets. And so they feel, to me, overall, the sense that I get of the objective cards in the Warpgate Beyond is that I am more in control and that I'm less at the victim of a tough lift that is an all or nothing proposition. And that part I appreciate. The other major change is that the techs and the powers and the special heroes seem to have ramped everything up to 11 in a way that I find very, very satisfying. It's so bizarre. So far, this has happened 3 times with all 3 of Wolff Designa's games. They release the base game, and I love it. I love everything that Wolff Designa's ever done. And then they come up with a second edition that makes me look back at the first edition and say, why was I okay with that at the time? It's not that bad. It's not like, how could I have enjoyed such a thing? But it's like, wow, you've ironed out flaws that I didn't perceive. And well, in the case of objective cards, that's not true. But in the case of the techs, a lot of techs in the base game you got either because that was the only tech you could get, or you got it just for the points because techs are worth points. They're all bananas now, which is wonderful. I'm very much a fan of a universe of very strong special effects, and Warpgate Beyond has definitely done that.
So you said there's techs. All of your starting player boards have a special ability as well. Game doesn't overstay its welcome. Nice, fast, quick, and the special power. Not only are the techs over the top, but even the player boards, which stayed the same, are very interesting things that change up the whole game. Like
yes,
mine. Like, you usually have a whole hand of cards that you can choose from. Mine, I only got 2 every turn, and I had to make very interesting decisions.
And the tech decks rebalancing made your faction stronger. Your faction in the base game, my perception was that it was a little weaker, but by virtue of the way that your faction works through action cards, you reshuffle your action card deck more frequently. Now there are a whole bunch of techs that trigger every time your action deck shuffled, and you made a very, very strong push at the beginning to get a couple of those, and you made very good use of them. It was wonderful. Seeing new elements introduced into a base game that key off of and improve elements of the base game to begin with, those are my favorite kinds of expansions. Those are my favorite kinds of revisions. And I love seeing great games like Warpgate get even better with expansions like Beyond. I can't wait for the published version of Trickshot second season. And I'm a huge, huge fan of what Artyom, Nichipurov, and Wolff Designa have done with Warpgate Beyond. We very much like the base game, and now I think it's even better.
Agreed.
Got to play a game called Code of Nine. This is a 10-year-old game designed by BakaFire. This is the same group or person. I'm not even sure how many people use this pseudonym. It could be one person, it could be several, who designed Tragedy Looper, a bizarre deduction game that, as far as deduction games go, I think is one of the better ones, as well as Sakura Arms, one of our favorite 2-player card battling games, if not our absolute favorite. And Code of Nine is a sort of pseudo-deduction worker placement game. It is very stripped down in terms of rules. You have 3 workers, you go to a place, and typically the actions are some version of pay some of the one currency of the game, get this token. It's like, all right, but what actually makes it work and an interesting game is the victory conditions are unknown to you at the start of the game. There are, of a deck of upwards of 20 different victory conditions, 9 are in play. One of them will not score, it's face-up visible on the table, but there are abilities that can cause them to swap. And so everyone knows at the start of the game a quarter of what the victory conditions are. And so a lot of the actions are about just plain looking at what other people's victory conditions are. But on top of that, you have to start making inferences, paying very close attention about who's getting what and why, and therefore trying to draft off of what they're trying to do. I was very pleased as well in Code of Nine because in starting round 3-ish, they're just, again, within a very simple rule system, there was this possibility of this bizarre conspiracy of where I thought that I could conspire with Walker to trigger a premature end to the game. And little did he know that I had a card that said if anyone's holding the medal, which is a unique token that you just get by going to a space and get the medal, they lose 50 points, which is a lot. And so I thought Walker and I were going to conspire, and then I was going to laugh. But no, that did not happen. The conspiracy fell apart. It was enjoyable. I really liked it. I was shocked by how much I enjoyed Code of Nine. I was expecting a relatively procedural sort of place the actions, get the tokens, someone has points. But the deduction aspect and the amount of play in the simple action spaces were very impressive. What did you think, Walker?
I think it was great. Just like you said, it was a little bit long for what it did. But,
really?
Well, I think on a second play, it wouldn't be so bad because there's a lot of just figuring out what all of these spaces did.
Oh, that's true.
But they all sort of boil down to the same thing. Like you said,
yeah.
You're going to get some sort of currency of what, not, I shouldn't say currency, I guess some sort of token of which there's several, and they're all going to lead to some sort of victory points or even negative victory points, depending on what cards come into play. So
Yeah.
it's very much trying to get as much information as you can while at the same time collecting the tokens that you know of the cards that you have. And
Yeah,
very-
because going back to the medal, the specific example from our game, it is worth -2 points by itself. Walker had a card that said, actually, it's worth 5 more on top of that. So it was net worth 3. Walker got it early in the game and was sitting on it. Little did he know that I had the -50 point card. So it was evolving states of information. Yeah, the board, the information presentation, particularly on the board, is not well done. It's got this cursive handwriting that is difficult to read, more text than is strictly necessary, and it's very, very small. And so we were making, even people who were sitting in front of the board made reference to the back of the rulebook just for the explanation of the
and
board
it's
spaces.
a circle too. So of course, everyone has half the board upside down.
Yes. Now, I should point out, though, again, to emphasize how simple and straightforward Code of Nine is, I say rulebook, it is a rule sheet. It is it's just a folded in half piece of paper. It's that straightforward. I was very pleasantly surprised by Code of Nine. I'd be eager to play it again. I think with people who could properly internalize the board state, that's not a slide on the players, again, that's a slide on the board, we're talking 45, 60 minutes tops. Our game was only about 60 minutes after the rules explanation anyway.
And that's Code of Nine, designed by BakaFire and put out by Z-Man Games. I also got to play a game called American Psycho, a killer game. So this is designed by Dan Blanchett and put out by Renegade Game Studios. It is a trick-taking game that came out last year and plays a lot more like a trick-taking game that came out several years ago. Just because it doesn't feel as though they did anything clever or interesting. They just added a whole bunch of stuff to a trick-taking game. It's just like, now if you lose, you get these cards, and now there's all these other things. It just seemed to be like more stuff, where these more things like the Christmas...
Ghosts of Christmas,
Cat in a Box, the Crew, they all do very, very clever things that change up how a trick-taking game works. And this one just, for me, did not feel as though it did that.
I will absolutely grant that the past few years have seen a lot of innovation in the trick-taking game space. And I will grant you that American Psycho doesn't measure up at all. I think one of the interesting things, though, is that whoever leads every trick, they have additional conditions that they can choose between one or the other. For example, you might have a card that says, well, whoever wins this trick, instead of winning 1 card for their squirrel pile, gets to win 2. Or instead, they could pick the winner of this trick is whoever plays the lowest card rather than the highest card. They pick one of those, and that will help influence what happens. That part was potentially interesting, but the problem is that it helped sap one of the key virtues of a lot of trick-taking games, which is the flow. Usually in trick-taking games, you set up the parameters of the round, everyone internalizes what's going to happen in the round. That might change from round to round, right? Whether you're playing the Crew or indeed anything else. But then trick to trick follows pretty organically one to the next. You might have some angst about what to lead. Well, I do anyway when trick-taking games. But in American Psycho, every trick was like, okay, that trick was done. Here's the new card. Read the 2 conditionals and then decide what to play. So that part was unfortunate, I think, really ruined the tempo, and I agree. The other mechanical aspects of American Psycho didn't measure up. It's also the case that I would highly recommend not playing this game with people who haven't seen the movie.
Yeah, it very much had like sort of Groundhog Day vibes, right? Where if you know the IP that it's based on, you're really very much going to enjoy this game.
Right. And if you don't... So here's the thing, just for a little bit of context, and I'm not going to go into a full, masterpiece theater thing here. American Psycho, if you don't get the satire, is tasteless and awful and super weird, and not in a good way. And it's hard to explain the relevance of someone playing the Reservation at Dorsia card to someone who hasn't seen the movie. It's like, well, it's all about social status and this weird thing about... It's very funny in context, and everyone's like, yeah, sounds hilarious. It really limits the game. And on top of that, there are some crude pencil drawings that are evocative of Patrick Bateman's crude pencil drawings that are discovered later on in the movie. Spoilers, I suppose. And again, out of context, they're deeply inappropriate. And so I think I will fault the designers for trying to generalize some of the aspects of American Psycho into something else. I think the satire doesn't translate super well, but it really doesn't translate well at all if you haven't seen the movie. So again, mixed company? No. Not for people who have seen the movie. I think I like hard pass. I think it's genuinely inappropriate for people who haven't seen the movie. And that's unfortunate because, it's a reasonably, I guess by this point, it's a reasonably old movie. It's a great movie. I highly recommend it. And it understood what it was doing, and it was a very delicately crafted satire. The trick-taking version of it is not.
But it does come in a box about 5 times the size it needs to be.
Well, there's a board and little trackers for the
Comes
board.
in like a generic Ticket to Ride size box.
It's not that big. It's smaller than a Ticket to Ride box.
For a trick-taking game. Not that much smaller.
Walker, do you like Huey Lewis in the News? So that was American Psycho, a killer game by Dan Blanchett and Renegade Game Studios. Finally, for me, got to play a game called Sabika. I'd been looking forward to this. We streamed this on Saturday. And this is designed by Herman P. Millan, published by Ludonova. Herman P. Millan is the one who designed Bitoku, the medium-heavy-ish game themed around Japanese folklore that we both enjoyed reasonably well and reviewed not too long ago. And it was on that basis that I decided to track down Sabika. Anytime there's a new designer to me who puts out something that I like, I'm eager to try it again. This is Sabika is a game about building the Alhambra during the Nasrid dynasty. And I have to give it credit. It clearly puts in more effort to historically situate the construction of the Alhambra than lots of other games, even those about constructing the Alhambra. So this is not a simplistic tiling affair. This cares very much about the cultural significance of the poetry that was engraved and bedazzled, I use that in the generic term, on the walls of various edifices within the Alhambra, about there were various levels of construction of the Alhambra and various cultural complications with respect to the Nasrid dynasty and the local Christian population. And there's lots of there's credit to the cultural consultants at the beginning of the rulebook. All of that I very much appreciated. Now, the gameplay itself...
I was about to say...
Yeah. Walker, why don't you take us away?
I was about to say that none of what you're doing in this game makes you feel like you're doing anything.
Agreed.
In my opinion. It is very much a straight-up Euro game. You are collecting these things. There's going to be... Mark's going to talk about something in the topic, which I'm going to come back to speak about. But it's very much of just going through the actions. I very much enjoyed it. It really comes back to an interesting rondelle system where there is definitely blocking.
Oof.
There is definitely holding off on actions, waiting for people to move. The core of why I love rondelle systems. Very interesting game. Sort of picking out your victory conditions at the end. The currency was so tight. The
money is so excruciatingly scarce in Sabika. The way the rondelle system works is you can move, there are 3 different rondelles and you have 4 workers, 2 on the outer rondelle, 1 in each of the inner ones. And you first read the rules and okay, you can move up to 2 spaces for free. Every additional space is 1 denarii and you pay an additional denarii for every worker in your space. Oh, okay, fine. Action selection will be a breeze. No, 1 denarii can cripple you.
It's true. Overall, I enjoyed it. I'm going to keep it for a while and give it a whirl.
It was a fascinating take on order fulfillment in that the orders were all super generic, and that turned out to be for the game's benefit. Normally, in games of this ilk, you have a whole bunch of different buildings you can construct, and this building wants 1 piece of marble and 2 wood, and you put that in, and the points come out. In Sabika, it's like, oh, you want to build something? Put whatever you want in. And then it's just every resource is worth a certain number of points. The entire game is built around a unified point conversion engine. And rather than stripping that of character, it rather opens you up in a way. And so you're not constantly worried about the precise combination and combinatorics of the goods you have. You can instead focus on the fact that you don't have enough money and there's never enough money.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to talk about later. It's like there is one small section of the game that says you must start this off with a wood or stone or something. But then after that, everything else is optional. And things are worth a certain amount of victory points. So you can start funneling these resources in, but it's totally your choice. It's not, you have to have 2 cabbages and a tomato or else too bad. It's like, if you want points, then you better have some extra resources to dump into it.
Yes. And I enjoyed a lot of the trade-offs. I wish there had been a little bit more thematic coherency. The game of Sabika sprawls a little bit more than we'd like. So, for example, Huey and I focused a lot on sending ships out because there's a fair number of somewhat disconnected mechanisms. But the game isn't really built around that because there's only 1 worker in the central rondelle that manages all the things relating to ships. And so we thought, oh, let's focus on ships. Oh, we can't really. The Sabika wants us to focus more on building the Alhambra, which is reasonable and legitimate. But suffice to say, I wish it had been a little bit tighter, a little bit more focused.
Yeah, and sort of more guidance on what things are worth, because there's this interesting sort of points every round type thing. The first round, they wanted us to do poems, and we're going to get a certain amount of points for poems, and then that poem victory thing will score every round. But on the next round will be something else, and this will add to this queue of things that are going to score every round
where there's scoring.
Every round. And that it was...
I need to forestall the legions of actuallys. There are people right now with their fingers hovering above the keyboards with their actually reply right now.
It's true.
We know we don't score it every round, people. Thank you very much. We appreciate your listening.
And those were really not worth very much.
Nope.
And that wasn't clear. And in that sort of mechanism, you'd think that would be a big part of the scoring.
Yeah.
And upon reflection, it was like, okay, well, I'm going to not focus on those as much and focus on these other things. And maybe the game will play differently if you're not focused on
Which again, made me hope that the game, made me wish that Sabika had been a little bit tighter, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about getting marble and glazed ceramic and then shoving marble and glazed ceramic in for 3 and 4 points respectively. And that's fine. That's a game. You don't then also need this other weird thing about shipping boats and this other thing about the Sultan's favor, which is mostly a distraction, and these events that don't...
Feeding your worker type mechanism.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so maybe 1 or 2 of those could have gone by the wayside, I think, and that would have been equally satisfying.
Agreed. And that is Sabika. Now on to the news and why it doesn't matter. I wanted this to be right next because Bamboo. Same designer as Sabika and Bitoku, and it has very reminiscent parts of Bitoku. It's the same sort of spirits, same sort of region. Some people are saying it's like sort of I don't want to say dumbed down, but a lesser version of Bitoku. But the more I read into it, it seemed like it was very much a different game. And it should be out very soon, and definitely because we've enjoyed these last 2 games quite a bit, I'm going to give Bamboo a try because the art is sort of reminiscent of Bitoku, which I love, but also very cartoonish, very interesting looking. Bamboo. Cyclades is an older game that was out before. And
before
now,
time was recorded, I think.
I think so. And now they're going to do a big Kickstarter in the second quarter of this year. And
for a new sort of consolidated edition.
Yes, the legendary edition. So Cyclades was the sort of, put out units, build the big metropolis type city, and it was sort of like the end game was very precipitous.
Yeah.
You're not sure when it's going to happen. It could happen way before you think it was going to, but it has this fantastic action bidding system, and thankfully it looks as though they're not going to change that. I think they might change up what the actions do a little bit, but other than that, so lots of things that are going to change, sort of building the map at every game, all sorts of different things. I don't want to get, because, of course it's a Kickstarter. Everything's up in the air.
Yeah.
And just not only because it's a Kickstarter, but because of Kickstarters now, it's even more so up in the air.
No kidding, yeah.
And lastly for me, Holy Grail Games, unfortunately, has closed their doors. I'm sort of feel bad a bit because we did talk about Copan, the Dying City. That was the latest game they just did on Kickstarter, and if people have backed it because they heard it here, unfortunately, it is now dead in the water. The bankruptcy people are going to be trying to get people refunds. They immediately closed the pledge manager. People are saying it should have been closed a little sooner. Like planning for bankruptcy usually is a little more, time involved than they knew, and it should have been closed a little sooner than it was. I don't know.
Sometimes bankruptcy happens like the end game of Cyclades.
It's true.
That's what they say in bankruptcy law.
It's unfortunate. Holy Grail Games did great games like Titan and other games like that.
Yeah, so Grail Games went under, and now Holy Grail Games, I don't know, man.
They've cited problems with the distributor they've been using, like not putting out the games. Unfortunately, it's Rally.
Have been reporting that. Yeah, a lot of disappointment from distributors, a lot of shipping problems, a lot of fulfillment partners not holding up their ends of the bargain. It's really rough out there.
And so that totally held back Rallyman, the new Rallyman.
Yeah, Rallyman GT
is now also in limbo.
Yes, a lot of people didn't get their copies. Some copies escaped into the wild, so it's a scalper's paradise right now. It's a whole thing. Tragic situation for all involved, really. Finally, for me, our 2020 game of the year, Cosmic Frog, by the iconoclast mad genius of board gaming, Jim Falley at Devious Weasel. The expansion is incoming. There's been details teased on Twitter throughout the months, very much like those incredibly sadistic designers of Phantom Division who keep showing pictures or little tweets about, oh, I got to do progress on the... Give me Phantom Division.
Yeah, fake news.
Yes. Give me also the expansion to Cosmic Frog. Find Muck. Do you get it, Walker? Find Muck?
Find Muck.
Find Muck. It introduces psychic combat. Do you get the joke now?
I got it.
Okay, good. I'm glad. It's important to me that you get the joke. More frogs, more ways to mess with your opponents, more types of terrain, more ways to risk.
More reasons to get it to the table.
More reasons to get it to the... Absolutely. Cosmic Frog, best game of 2020, fabulous game. Soon, more frogs.
That, more regurgitating frogs. And that is the news and why it doesn't matter. Now, on to our topic of the week.
You know, it comes from their gullet. It comes out, it doesn't say in the gullet. You regurgitate the...
I love both those words, gullet and regurgitation. In the sense.
Yep, yeah.
So good.
Let's not breeze past that.
Game design trends.
So what is it that you think... I'm thinking about this because I go through waves of criticizing certain types of games for being overly derivative. And it seems awfully negative to have that as being the springboard. But there's this pattern that I've observed in a lot of game design elements where it's like, oh, well, this is fun. This is great. I see the virtues of a particular game design element. And then it's like, this is wonderful. Great innovation, and then after a while, there's a tipping point, and then it's like, oh, this again?
Yeah. Like I say, one big game will come out with a very interesting sort of mechanism,
right.
And then you'll see all these things burst off of it, be it polydominoes or
yep,
zombies
absolutely.
or whatever, and then it'll be like, okay, enough already.
Yeah.
Or it'll be derivative, it'll just be the same thing
absolutely.
with a different theme.
Absolutely. So in terms of theme, this happens all the time. But I find that less interesting because I'm less equipped to talk about specifically how themes are overexploited or exploited in the same way. But in terms of game design elements, these are very much things that have my mind. So I don't know how you want to proceed generally, but I'd like to start off with a question about contemporary. If there's an overused game design element for most designs recently, like this year, past year, what would you say that would be, if there is any? No, none is a perfectly acceptable answer.
True. I think recipe fulfillment, I think, is what we're going to be talking about.
I agree 100%. And order fulfillment is absolutely, I think, the current overused game design element.
I don't even want to say overused. I really want to go with just lazy design element.
Well, but that's just it. It tends to be... Yeah, I guess you're right. If it was overused but always done well, that would be a different story entirely. Because it's striking. It's very appropriate, I think. I didn't even know that this would coincide. The AYURIS is Whale Riders, which is an order fulfillment game, but it doesn't feel lazy. It doesn't feel derivative. It doesn't feel hacky. Whereas, I'm going to pick on Bot Factory, all right? Bot Factory, for me, felt like order fulfillment the game in the sort of most trivial, banal way. I'm not going to say that it's overly derivative because it is indeed an adaptation of an earlier game that did order fulfillment, and I can't comment on Kanban because I'm the last person on Earth who has not yet played Kanban. But given that there are only 3 different kinds of orders and 9 different kinds of parts, and that's all you were doing in Bot Factory, it really made me think, oh yeah, order fulfillment is just all we do now.
Really? I thought Flamecraft would come to mind first.
Oh,
oh my God.
Look, I'm not going to give Flamecraft any passes. It's absolutely there too. But Flamecraft at least has the decency to try to work a little bit harder to deceive you into doing other things. Especially in the way that the right building can pop up and suddenly someone is earning an incredible amount of points by not interacting with the order fulfillment elements.
Just on a quick side note about hiding things, because I just have 2 things that we're not going to talk about is hiding the catch-up mechanic. So that's sort of like the new trend that's coming is the best way to hide it.
Okay.
Because in the old days it was just like sort of a blunt hammer. You know, if you're in last place, get 20 points. You know, and now they understand that people want the games close and no one wants to feel like losing, and B, people hate catch-up mechanics. So you sort of have to put a veneer of hiding.
I feel like
behind the scenes.
I feel like A has been true for a long time, but I think B has gotten more pointed lately. I think the catch-up mechanisms have been very much on the mind, especially in terms of Euro design, for decades. But I think the desire to be more subtle with it. Like, I'm thinking of games like Power Grid. Power Grid is incredibly blunt about its catch-up mechanism. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of Power Grid traditionally understood. But I agree with you. I think that is one of the design things that people are struggling over. Someone might come up with something brilliant, and then maybe it'll be overused. That's the new horizon. it's just going back to order fulfillment. I remember when talking about Voyages of Marco Polo, right? Voyages of Marco Polo was one of the first games I remember pointing to its use of order fulfillment and saying, you know what? Order fulfillment is a good way to give someone some guidance in the early part of the games about what they should do. And now...
and look at us now.
Look at us now. I'm so jaded. Okay, so I've also been thinking about about similar trends, the previous equivalences of order fulfillment. I wasn't in the hobby in the 1980s, but I can definitely think of some of the, recurring things that happened in the 1980s. When I think of the 1980s, I think of CRTs, combat results tables, where, you figure out combat factors and you chuck a couple of dice and you get a result or a single result. There are some games that I still play that do this, primarily successors, but these even survive. There's one contemporary game walker, one of the most played games in the world, that still has basically a CRT. Do you know what it is?
I do not.
40K.
Oh.
Strength versus toughness, baby.
True.
That's basically a CRT, and it's pretty much one of the only quote-unquote contemporary games. Even modern versions of Games Workshop games tend to do away with that kind of comparison. I was shocked when Warcry still had the old-fashioned strength versus toughness comparison chart. But we don't do charts anymore. Charts are definitely on the way out.
Yes.
As far as game design goes. So I think the next big thing in terms of hobbyist gaming can be traced. It's weird. I was looking at this, just trying to, again, situate things historically. So when I think about the biggest influences or the biggest market movers in terms of the 90s, I think of two games that were both released in 95. I think of El Grande and I think of Settlers of Catan. But those I don't think are really the ones that established the major design trends that you then got seen overused. When I think of the 90s, I think of auctions. I think of overdone auction games, right? So 1992's Modern Art. I don't know if they were explicitly inspired by games like Modern Art specifically, but you look at the designs of the mid to late 90s, auctions everywhere. The joke was, for a long time, that eventually you were going to have a culmination of every Euro design element in a game where you auctioned off trains in ancient Egypt. And then someone designed that game and called it Cleopatra's Caboose. It took them a few years to get released, and by that point the joke was old, which is unfortunate, but there you have it. Which is weird, because El Grande having really revolutionized action cards and in combination with area majority, and Settlers having gone like gangbusters, we didn't see a huge glut in the late 90s of either area majority games, action card games, or negotiation games, which is strange. It was auctions all the time. You auctions, then do actions. Princess of Florence, Goa. Just auctions everywhere. Auction games. These resources are with points. How do the resources go into the game? Who gets what resources? Let's auction them off. There we go. Game is done. I remember we both talked about this when reviewing Furnace, because it felt like a throwback in the best possible way. Right?
Exactly. Yes.
Felt like a really, really, really good example of what you might have seen during the late 90s, but slightly better because of a variety of clever design decisions. And then we have the aughts. And I still think the early aughts, we're still kind of in the auction boom. The games that I think really disrupted and established the sort of game design trends in the early aughts. What would you say characterized a lot of what was going on in the shortly after the turn of the century?
In the early 2000s, I have two things here. I have the Gates of Loang was our first sort of recipe fulfillment. An Uwe Rosenberg game. And he sort of picks up on a lot of trends, because most things that I want to talk about were Matt Gertz in 2005 puts out Antiki.
Uh-huh.
And that's when sort of a little bit of boom of rondelles starts, right? And I think it's, even this year, a lot of the games that we talked about today and a lot of the games that we've had our lists, which I'll get into later, have rondelles in them.
And this I find interesting, because when I think of 2005 and eras like that, I think of 2007's Agricola. I think of worker placement. Now, Agricola wasn't the first worker placement game. Arguably, the first one was Aladdin's Dragons in 2000. It was kind of a hybrid worker placement auction game. Quelle surprise! And Kalis was in 2005, and that's also a worker placement game. But when I think of the trend that... Perhaps I was just too focused on trends that were driven into the ground, because for me, rondelles can still be fresh in a lot of instances. Because when you look at the late aughts, oh my goodness, the number of forgettable worker placement games that got churned out in the immediate aftermath of Agricola. Just endless, and I think persisted for almost 10 years. We don't see a whole heck of a lot of them anymore. I mean, there's still bad worker placement games all the time. Like, After the Empire, I maintain, is still one of the worst games I played when reviewing this podcast.
And a lot of things are mislabeled. It's like, as worker placement, it's really just action selection. They give you these tokens that they tell you that are workers, and they say it's a worker placement game, but it's really at its core, it's just action selection.
Well, sure, we've had this argument before with respect to things like Scythe. It's like, but it's called a worker. It's like, well, you're placing a worker, but it's not really. Anyway, that's not the point. I mean, games like Agricola were all over the place. I mean, you talked about Uwe Rosenberg. Uwe Rosenberg himself was a one-man game design trend for worker placement.
It's true.
That persists to this day, quite frankly. And again, worker placement, when it first came on the scene, everyone's like, ooh, the turns are so quick. Ooh, there's blocking. Ooh, look at all this. And now we're like, yeah, sure, worker placement. Again, there are still great worker placement games.
Yeah, they do some extra things, like number of workers you get to place somewhere. And now they use dice, which is my favorite thing. Dice is worker placement.
Sure.
And the value on the dice matter, stuff like that.
Sure. So in terms of rondels being a game design trend, I personally feel, and tell me if you disagree, so for a while, Matt Gertz was more or less the only one doing it.
Now, that being said,
see,
because Matt Gertz hasn't put out many games lately.
He's mostly been doing Concordia stuff.
But Vladimir Suchy has been putting out games, and he too, back in 2009, started work with rondels. He put out a game called Shipyard.
Oh yes, I do remember Shipyard. Shipyard was, I think, the first. It was very much part of my Vladimir Suchy generalization, where it's like, oh yeah, great fun for a couple games, and then starts to feel samey. The notable thing about Shipyard, have you ever played Shipyard?
No, I have not.
Yo dog, I heard you liked rondels. There are so many rondels in Shipyard. It is amazing.
And then around 2012, in that area, then that's where it became, we're just going to make the whole board a giant rondel.
That's true. You're right.
So, right, we have the Tolkien the Mayan Calendar, Great Western Trail, and Icky, where it was just the whole board was a rondel. You went around and you did your things.
You're absolutely right. No, you've convinced me. I'll tell you exactly why I was blinded to this as an overall trend, because for me, it's a Matt Gertz thing. And this is entirely my own bias, right? I've done some translation work with Matt Gertz. He's designed some of my favorite games. And so to me, as a mechanism, it is indelibly associated with Matt Gertz. And this is not fair. It is not accurate. Even if you agree with me that the best rondel games are designed by Matt Gertz, he doesn't get to own the entire thing, right? And you're right that games like Great Western Trail and Iki, and even Tolkien have innovated and elaborated on how to use rondels to influence action selection. So yeah, you've completely convinced me. You're right.
And then it advances a little bit more. Right, we get to 2018 where we get Crusaders, right, where we had this very interesting sort of
the mandala, yeah.
Upgradable
Mancala, rather, sorry.
Yeah, Mancala, upgradable rondel system, and also that's when the first T game came out, which is Teotihuacan, which was once again just a giant rondel that you went around, sort of rondel action selection, and this is where they introduced the dice system, rondels with dice.
Yeah, that was sort of like a combination of using rondel and dice worker placement, right? Both of those threads that you're pulling out. You're very good at this.
And then of course what picked that up almost immediately was in the next year after that, Red Cathedral came out, which we just talked about, which is exactly the same thing.
Dice on a rondel,
Very interesting dice manipulation on a rondel.
Yeah. It's interesting. Some of the other trends, and there's a couple more that I want to talk about briefly, I feel have been implemented in extremely lazy ways. When I think about rondels specifically, I can't think of, certainly not a glut of designs that have done it where I'm like, using a rondel again as a lazy way to do action selection, whatever. To me, it's always been, at the very least, neutral to good. Can you think of counterexamples? Or again, am I just blind?
No, I don't think so at all. I think they even at their core, I think they're a fantastic way. They're a way to make sure you don't get to do the same action multiple times in a row. They're a way to make sure that there is a space. You can make one action very powerful, because in some games, if it's action selection, people are just going to take that over and over again. But if you put it on rondel, they can only take it, once every few turns, because they have to make their way around. And I guess people could also say that's just, lazy design as well, but I really don't think it is. I just think it's a very interesting way to sort of space out, unequal actions.
And again, just talking about the rondel and Matt Gertz, I think you could even point to games like Concordia as a slight evolution of the rondel, as a way, as you say, to space out actions in the genre of game that we call deck management games, where your entire deck is your hand, and you play cards, and then you play another card and get all your cards back. It has very rondel-esque features, although not with the spatial aspect. And again, I think it's fair to attribute to Matt Gertz popularizing that. I don't think that that's been overdone either. I can't really think of it. Now, in terms of using dice in interesting ways, which is kind of another thing that Euro design goes in and out of. Sometimes Euros hate dice for a few years and then they rediscover them. Roll and writes are a huge design trend that I think we can probably point to Welcome To as really, popularizing that recently. Although Knizia has been designing roll and writes since the 90s. Especially if you look back at his decathlon and things like that. And he's always been playing with dice. He loves dice. He's a mathematician. But when thinking in terms of a Euro game that was using dice kind of sort of as a worker placement, but it was more drafting, that I felt, this is derivative and uninspired, I can think of Coimbra. And I can think of some other games where it's like,
Yeah. Sort of forced dice. Yeah.
Yeah, so the dice element, I think, sometimes is done well, sometimes has been overused, but rondels, for me, remain fresh. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just because they're not as prevalent.
Yeah, I really like the dice use in Quarriors was very interesting as well. Sort of the deck building, using the dice to,
Oh, sure. Yeah, but that's a different thread of dice development entirely, yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, I wanted Quarriors to be better than it was. I felt it was just a little too in and out.
Well, I think if it was re-implemented today, I think it would be much more streamlined. I think would be better.
Sure.
So just to finish off the rondels, because it just brings us up to today. There was a game called Corrosion. I really wish I got you to play it. I'm hoping to pick it up again because I really want to show that to you. It's sort of like your rondel sort of forced around, and you got to sort of plan ahead and get mechanisms out in front of your thing that's continuously corroding your machine as it goes around. And that's also paired up with very interesting card play. And then games that we've talked about not only today, but just very recent. We have Sabika, Woodcraft, Tiletum, and Terracotta Army, which, brings this sort of rondel to the next level. Now we have triple layers. We have rondels that turn and sort of change the actions up, what they can do, and they let you to sort of manipulate not only with dice, but with resources, which actions you can take on the rondel.
Far be it for me to enter into this marvelously illuminating discussion, quibbling about genre distinctions. But I think of Tiletum and Terracotta Army in particular as worker placement games where the worker spaces happen to be on a circle rather than a rondel. For me, the key element to a rondel is the movement, right? I put my worker or my action selection or my pawn or whatever or my die in this spot in a previous round, and by virtue of having placed it here in a previous turn, that influences where I can go on my future turns. You don't have that in those games. The wheel is just a way to slightly randomize or influence what the worker placement action does. But I'll grant you, it is nonetheless can be attributed to part of that overall design philosophy of reimagining action spaces in a wheel-like element. So when I think of the overused, sort of tired mechanism that predated order fulfillment, I think of tableau building. I think of the legions of tableau builders that came in the wake of terraforming Mars. And this, too, kind of a bit like worker placement to even a greater degree. Tableau builders have been in Euro design for a long, long time. I mean, I keep getting shocked at the time period between Race for the Galaxy and Terraforming Mars. Race for the Galaxy was the big tableau builder that I remember playing, but it didn't seem to inspire the same number of derivative also-rans. Like the number of tableau builders in the wake of Terraforming Mars, massive. In various combinations, first you auction and then you have a tableau, or this is a worker placement game with tableau building, like you see in Everdell, or any number of other,
Let's remember Hansa Teutonica was 2009.
Yeah. But that's just it. I'm glad you brought that up, frankly, because to me, one of the great things about Hansa Teutonica is I can't peg it into a genre. What's its primary mechanism? It's a game like Hansa Teutonica. Seriously,
it's true.
In a hobby where we can categorize and divvy things up ad infinitum, there are things you can talk about. You can talk about action improvement. You can talk about upgrades. You can talk about spatial blocking. You can say it's a root connection game. None of those fully articulate what's going on.
Well, a little bit of tableau building, you could say.
We've had this disagreement for years, Walker. I don't think it's a tableau builder when you're removing cubes from your display. I don't think that characterizes it. For me, a tableau builder is when you're acquiring new bits.
It gives you new bits by removing the cubes.
Yeah, okay, fine, whatever. Put it to the side. We'll agree to disagree on whether or not Hansa Teutonica is a tableau builder. I say it's not. You say it is. Okay, fine. We'll put it off to the side. But the core, Hansa Teutonica didn't feel derivative when it was published, even though it felt like a throwback to earlier elements of stripped down Euro game design, and it hasn't really been copied in any major way, which is great because it stands alone in its genius. But oh my goodness, do you remember Alien Artifacts, Walker, or have you shoved it for?
Oh my lord!
I know. Just when you make a bad tableau builder, it's so bad it can be terrible. There are lots of great tableau builders, and many of them even predate Terraforming Mars. We prefer 51st State Master Set. Which, I mean, even if you ignore the fact that it's an evolution of 51st State, and I prefer Race for the Galaxy, and I prefer Innovation, all of them predate Terraforming Mars, but just in the wake of Terraforming Mars, so many. And this is to say nothing of, again, going back in time, the great earthquake that was 2011's Risk Legacy, and the massive push, which we still feel today, especially on Kickstarter, of everything needing to be a campaign.
Campaign and or legacy, just having the ongoing effects.
Which got much worse in the wake of Gloomhaven, right? It wasn't just the legacy elements introduced by Davio, but Gloomhaven had such a massive effect on the market. I can't help but feel that people on Kickstarter are still chasing those Gloomhaven dollars. Now, sometimes you get surprise hits. I remain shocked at how great Oathsworn is.
It's true.
Who could think? But you see so many things on crowdfunding and elsewhere where they're clearly please think we're like Gloomhaven, please.
Yeah, this massive campaign with figures and endless play.
Yeah. And I remember, again, Legacy to me, I think, had the shortest shelf life for my enthusiasm. Because Risk Legacy, I remember having tons of fun with. We're opening boxes. Look, there's an entire new faction there. Whee! And that was about it. I even got tired of it midway through Pandemic Legacy Season 1. So I think I'm a little bit out of step.
I haven't even looked into the new Legacy Risk. There's a whole new
Risk
Legacy box, and I haven't even cared.
We're well past caring about campaigns now, but I think part of that is a professional hazard. I don't know if back in the pre-podcast days, if we'd have more endurance for campaigns.
Maybe,
maybe not. It's tough to tell, but there are a lot of... There are too many campaign games in the market for dedicated hobbyists to be able to consume.
I think almost that could have even been one of the reasons why I started, right? It's just you see all these we had campaigns on our shelves, yet another. Are we going to start another one again?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you, Walker. Coming into this topic, I approached it purely from a negative way. Now, granted, I would always be conscious of the counterexamples of good versions, right? There are still great worker placement games being done. There's still great auction games. All of these categories of games that I say are overdone, you still see great examples of these being released, right? Again, Whale Riders is an order fulfillment game, and I'm tired of order fulfillment games, but I will happily play Whale Riders at the drop of a hat. But I approach it primarily negatively, and I think that your little historical sketch of rondelles, and sometimes more specifically Dyson rondelles, is a great example of a long-standing trend that I haven't gotten sick of yet. And so thank you for that. I appreciate that little burst of sunshine.
I'm happy to help. The one last thing I want to talk about trends in game, which is great that they now introduce, is inclusion. And it's being massively across the board. Everyone is definitely trying their best, and I'm very happy to see the results. And it is slowly but surely being done.
Yeah, just the other day, Chip III remarked on the rulebook and reference works to Order of Nine, saying how jarring it is to see the male pronoun used as neuter. And that's a very, very recent trend, just in the past few years or so, and it's great. It's not strictly game design, but you're absolutely right. Much more important than the fact that auction games are overplayed is the fact that more or less the industry is now on the right page in terms of inclusion, in terms of representation, in terms of acknowledging the fact that gamers are not the monolith that they have been misperceived as for a very long time. Thank you, Walker. Another excellent note. And on that positive note, thank you very much for joining us for So Very Wrong About Games. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find all our contact information on our glorious website. Everything about swag is glorious, but our website especially so.
It burns your eyes with the brightness.
SoWrongGames.com, specifically in this case, SoWrongGames.com/contact. We read everything you send us. We'll get back to you if we can, and we love hearing from you. Thank you so much for deciding to spend your time with us. We hope to see you again soon.
Peace!
You've been listening to So Very Wrong About Games, produced by Michael Walker and edited by Mark Bickney. Special thanks goes to What Does It Eat for generously allowing us to use their most excellent song, FOS, as our theme. You can find them at whatdoesiteat.com. You can reach us by email at soverywrongaboutgames@gmail.com or on Twitter at SoWrongGames. Thanks very much, see you next time, and always, try to be right, but remember you are so very wrong.